Let's first address the issue where I lose my list of cuisines when I edit a restaurant. So if I change the cuisine here from none to Mexican and click Save, I've completely lost my list of cuisines, yet that change was sent to the data source. So my no-name restaurant does have a cuisine type of Mexican. And the problem here is that I only populate this cuisines property to bind against during an onGet request. What happens during an onPost request? Well, cuisines is never populated. So over in the CS.html file, when I say ASP-items equals model.cuisines, cuisines is going to be null. So the simple fix here is to have this particular piece of information generated on both a get and a post. And the reason I left that problem in here is just to prove that ASP.NET Core is stateless. There's nothing in the framework that's going to magically and automatically rebuild the options in my select. I need to take responsibility for building these select items, and I need to do that during onPost if I'm going to present this form to the user again. Note that I don't necessarily need to do that for restaurant data. In fact, since we're not using this property, after I've called restaurant data.update, I could remove this assignment to the restaurant data. That restaurant information is still going to be available because it's the restaurant information that was sent back from the user. In other words, when I change the cuisine here from Mexican back to none and click Save, why is a location populated? Well, it's populated because the restaurant.location property is populated. That happened due to the magic of model binding. And in fact, what we can find out is that the ASP-4 tag helper that we're using to populate our inputs with values can really rely on the raw data that the user has provided, so data that might not even fit into my model. I'll show you an example of that later in the course, but for right now, adding this line of code inside of onPost should fix my list of cuisines. Now what about the empty name problem? Well, during an onPost operation, you need to perform some sort of model validation. You can never trust input from the user, so you need to make sure that the input the user is providing is valid. One way to do that, the hard way to do that, would be to place if-else statements here. So I could say if the restaurant.name is not empty and it's not null, and if the location is not empty and not null, and if the length of the name is beneath a certain threshold. Only if all those statements are true, only then should you do the restaurant data.update. But ASP.NET Core and .NET in general provides an easier way to do common validations. You can have these common validation checks done for you by adding attributes to your model objects. So for example, here on the restaurant, I want to make name a required field. No one should be able to enter a restaurant that has a null or empty name. So I'm going to add a required attribute. This is from the system.componentModel.dataAnnotations namespace. I'm going to bring that in. And if you explore this namespace and look through the documentation for this namespace, you'll find a number of useful data annotations. So for example, I can make name required. I can also say that the maximum length of the name should be 80 characters. And I can do these as separate attributes. Some people even like to combine these. So it looks something like required comma and string length 80. I can do the same thing for location. Perhaps I want location to be required and also to have a maximum length of, let's say, 255 characters in this case. And there's also built-in validations to make sure that numbers are within a certain range, to compare two passwords, and to make sure that a string fits in the right pattern for a regular expression. I will also point out for more complex validations, there's an interface that you can implement iValidatable object. This will allow you to write custom code on your model or on your entity to perform validation checks. Now, ASP.NET Core, whenever it does model binding, so when it's binding form inputs to bind properties like restaurant, it's going to look at the restaurant type and see these data annotations and automatically run checks to make sure these annotations pass. We'll see how to inspect the result of that validation in the next clip.